Welcome to my true criminal abode. You are very, very welcome. So today's case is a doozy. If you don't know this case, which is about Steven Stayner, like me, you are going to be really freaking angry by the end of this case. The injustice at the end of this case is unreal. It's something else. You're going to be pissed. You're going to be really pissed. So today's case about Steven, it's really hard because on the one hand, it's a lovely case because this guy went through absolute crap and he did something incredible. And that's why this story is lovely to tell, because he did this amazing thing. Steven Stayner was a hero, but what he went through was horrendous. It was awful. And this is going to lead me actually to a really, really important trigger warning. You need to stay safe, mentally healthy. And this case deals with CSA. So if that is going to trigger you at all, please, 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 just look after yourself. Come back another time, either to this case on a day when you're feeling better, or come back to a different case, whatever. Just look after yourself, okay? Because there are descriptions of CSA in this case. I'm not going to be too explicit, but there will be a couple of really harrowing descriptions. Okay, so look after yourself. A lot of research went into this case. It's a biggie, actually. It's quite a big case. A lot happens. As ever, I will link to the sources below. A couple that I did use, I read a book by Mike Eccles called I Know My First Name is Steven, which you might be familiar with the film. It got made into a movie a little while later. And there was also last year a documentary series called Captive Audience. It covered mainly Steven's life, but it went into his brother a little bit as well, Cary Stayner. Now, I am not going to go into Cary Stayner in this video, but I am going to cover Cary Stayner. I have done the research. That's another biggie as well. And if you're interested in Cary, who is the complete opposite to his brother Steven, the two are just total different ends of the spectrum. Cary Stayner, not a nice man, did not do good things. Steven Stayner, hero. And for that reason, that's why I'm not putting the two brothers together. In some videos, Cary and Steven are kind of put together because they're brothers and from the same family, and, you know, it's the same kind of time period-ish. I don't want to do that because Steven deserves his own story. And so I'm just doing Steven today. So yeah, so I will be covering Cary Stayner in a different case, but today is just about Steven. Okay, so with that, shall we get on with it? I think so. Yeah. Okay. So Steven Gregory Stayner, he was born on April the 18th, 1965, in a place called Merced, which is in California. He had 4 other siblings. He had his older brother, Cary, and then he had 3 sisters as well, Cindy, Jodie, and Corrie. The 5 children lived with their parents, Kay and Delbert Stayner, and they lived, by 1972 anyway, they lived at a house on Betty Street, 1655 Betty Street in Merced. And Merced is a small rural community. It's about 60 miles west of Yosemite National Park, and because of its proximity to the park, and because Merced is kind of one of these towns that people pass through on the way to the park, it's known as the gateway to Yosemite. Before moving to Betty Street, the family had lived together on a 20-acre farm ranch. It was an almond orchard. And Steven, he loved that farm. He loved being outside, running around, climbing the trees. He loved playing with his dog. He just loved everything about farm life. Unfortunately, Delbert, he suffered from some health issues. I think the farm kind of began to take a little bit of a toll on his health. He slipped a disc, I believe. In 1971, there was a particularly dry spell, and the farm was kind of struggling financially. And I think this combination of the health issues and the financial issues, it kind of forced the family to sell the farm. And that's when they ended up in Betty Street, which is kind of where this case begins, really. When the family moved, Stephen, he really missed that farm life. He missed his friends. He missed his dog, because when the family moved, the house that they moved to, it was too small for the dog. They only had a small yard, so they ended up giving the dog away to another farm. And he just wasn't very, very happy. He went to Charles Wright Elementary School, and he didn't make friends easily. By the end of 1972, he was beginning to settle. He was beginning to make friends. He had one friend in particular called Sharon Carr, who was his best friend. And things were just getting better for Stephen generally. By December the 4th, 1972, it was his friend Sharon's birthday. She'd actually had a birthday party the day before. Her birthday was actually on the 4th, which is the Monday. So the day before, when the party was the Sunday. So they'd obviously had the party at the weekend. And Santa had been at this party because obviously it's December and it's quite near Christmas. And, Stephen was happy. He'd told Santa everything he wanted. He'd had a good time. So he was going to go to her house after school and drop off her present. But first, before he could do that, he had to go home, because he had been in trouble previously with his parents, because he would often, after school, just go to a friend's house and not tell them where he was, and they would worry, and his father would kind of give him a bit of a whipping. And not wanting another whooping from his father, he had made arrangements to go home first, show his face to his parents, do his chores, and then he was going to go to Sharon's birthday in the evening. So around about 2 p.m, he finished school and he was taking his normal route home. And he was actually only a few blocks from his house. He was really near his house. And that's when 30-year-old Irvin Edward Murphy approached Stephen. Murphy was handing out gospel tracts, and he stopped Stephen and gave him one of these tracts. And he asked Stephen if Stephen would have anything to donate to the church. Now, Stephen's 7, so he's not going to donate anything. And then Murphy said, "What about your mother?" Well, the family were quite religious. They had quite a strong Mormon faith that ran through the family. And so, Stephen said, my mother will donate to the church. And that's when Murphy said to Stephen, "Okay, that's great. We'll give you a lift home." So Stephen was a little apprehensive at first. He didn't just get in the car, but Murphy managed to persuade him, I think because of the religious background. Stephen kind of trusted his elders, for one thing, and also there was no reason not to trust this man that was handing out religious pamphlets. So in the end, Stephen agreed. He agreed to get in the car. And watching Murphy talking to Stephen was a 41-year-old man sitting in his white Buick truck. And this 41-year-old man was called Kenneth Parnell. Now, Kenneth, he had been wanting to take a little boy for a while. He had these religious tracts in his car, which he had used a few times before to try and take another little boy. And he managed to kind of rope Murphy into this plan. Murphy was somebody that Parnell worked with. And Murphy, he had a small stature, and that was one reason that Parnell used Murphy, because he kind of thought that his small stature would make him less intimidating to small children. And then also, the language of the time, described Murphy as being kind of a simple-minded man. And Parnell, he clearly used Murphy because of the way that people at the time described Murphy as being kind of simple-minded, naive. I'm sure nowadays there is a better politically correct term, but the language at the time, he was described as kind of simple-minded and naive. And these things Parnell was able to use to make him less intimidating to a child. So I don't know with Murphy how much he knew what Parnell was doing. Parnell told him that he wanted to take a child that was in some way disadvantaged, maybe didn't have the best family background, family home, and Parnell wanted to help a child. And I think Murphy, that's what Murphy believed. Now, this is just me. I don't think that he was being intentionally malicious. He was just not completely aware of everything. So Parnell was particularly crafty. And the other thing, of course, is that Parnell sat in the car watching this interaction. And by sitting in the car, it means that he's not involved. So if there's any witnesses, it's Murphy that people are going to see talking to Stephen, not Parnell. Parnell knew what he was doing. He was a manipulator. So he's watching this interaction. And when he realises that Stephen has agreed to get into the car, he drives on up and, pulls up next to them. And by this point, Stephen is convinced that they're going to take him home and he's going to talk to his mum and get a donation. So yeah, he gets in the car. And this is the moment when 7-year-old Steven Stayner is abducted. Parnell drives them 25 miles away to a little cabin in a place called Cathy's Valley, which was in Mariposa County, and was actually around about 50 miles away from Yosemite Lodge, which is where Parnell and Murphy were both working. And so they ended up in this sort of 2-bedroom rundown cabin. On the way to the cabin, Parnell actually stopped at a payphone. Don't forget, this was the 1970s. And he pretended to call Stephen's parents. And this is the beginning of the whole manipulation of Stephen. So Parnell pretended to call Stephen's parents, and basically what he tells Stephen for the next 7 years is that his parents don't want him anymore. His parents don't love him anymore. They can't afford him anymore. Over time, Stephen begins to believe this. Well, he totally believes this. I mean, it doesn't even take that long for Stephen to believe it. He's 7 years old. You've got this 40-something-year-old guy telling you your parents don't want you anymore. You don't know where you are. You've got nowhere to go. You don't know what to do. You begin to believe the person that's holding you captive. Except this is part of the cleverness of Parnell, because he doesn't at any point hold Stephen captive. The captivity that Stephen goes through is up here. It's all up here. It's mental manipulation, which Parnell insidiously drip feeds to Stephen. So this was the beginning. He'd stopped at this payphone and it's like, yeah, your parents said you can stay with me. And when they get to the cabin, there are a number of toys waiting for Stephen. So, it wasn't all bad initially for about 5 minutes, because that night, on the first night, Parnell made Stephen undress, take a shower, and get into the bed with him. Murphy was staying in, he stayed overnight, and from the bedroom he could hear Steven's screams. And this was the beginning. This was the beginning of 7 years for Steven. This was the beginning of Steven's new normal. This was to become normal for Steven. The next day, which was December the 5th, Parnell and Murphy had to go back to work, and they worked, like I say, at the Yosemite Lodge. And the two men took Steven with them. And when they arrived there, Parnell took Steven to a secluded area, kind of wooded area, and forced Steven to perform oral sex on him. And in a later interview, Steven actually said that he kind of just did what Parnell told him to do because he didn't want to fight and he didn't want to get into trouble. He just didn't have the fight in him, and he just did what he was told. Because this went on for years, and Steven would be fighting him for years, hence why he just gave in. So Parnell had kind of like a private dorm room at the lodge, and after assaulting Steven, he took Steven to his private dorm room, and there he kind of ploughed him with sleeping pills so that Parnell could just go back to his job. So he basically knocked Steven out on sleeping pills and went about his usual work. Murphy every now and then would go in and check on Steven, and he took Steven books and toys and food, things like that, whilst Parnell was working and whilst Parnell was ploughing him with sleeping pills. Poor Steven, he couldn't leave the room. He was using a bucket to go to the toilet in, and kind of Murphy was the only sort of person being nice to him, because obviously every time he saw Parnell was either drugging him or abusing him. In later interviews, Steven, I think, was very appreciative of what Murphy did for him, even though Murphy was part of the kidnapping. Like I say, he wasn't totally aware of everything. At least that's the impression that we get. So they were at this dorm room for quite a few days. It was around about the 11th that they actually went back to the cabin. It's mental to think that obviously this was a dorm room, so there were lots of rooms, lots of employees staying at this lodge, and nobody heard or saw anything. They went there on the 5th, so it was the 11th that they went back to the cabin. So they returned back to the cabin at Cathy's Valley, and actually Parnell buggers off again. He actually goes to visit his mother in Bakersfield, and he leaves Murphy in charge. And when Parnell returns back to the cabin, he actually brings with him a little puppy, a little 6-week-old Manchester Terrier that his mother had actually given him, but he brings it back and gives it to Steven. You know how much Steven missed his dog when they moved. So that's just another piece of the manipulation, because now Steven has something to be attached to, and Steven does become attached to this little dog, and he actually calls her Queenie. And I think Queenie was probably his only friend, really. Now, what Parnell also does is that he tells Steven he doesn't say he's been to see his mother. He tells Steven that he'd been away for the day because he'd been in court. He had been in court securing the paperwork because Steven's parents didn't want him anymore, and that it was now official. It was now signed off by a judge, and there was nothing that Steven could do. And, Steven 7, he believed Parnell when Parnell told him that he had official custody of him. At 7, what are you going to do? And there was nothing he could do, really. So on the way to Bakersfield, Parnell actually stopped at a service station, and he spotted a missing poster of Steven. And Parnell took note of the information that was on this poster. So he took note of Stephen's full name, of his date of birth, and also the description that was on this poster. So when Parnell got back to the cabin, he changed Stephen's name. So Stephen was to become Dennis Gregory Parnell. And Dennis Parnell was to begin calling Parnell Dad. A couple of days later, Parnell cut Stephen's hair and dyed Stephen's hair, so it was shorter and kind of a darker colour. So basically, the description that was on these posters was different to how Stephen now looked. So basically, within the space of a couple of days, Parnell totally eradicated Stephen's identity. So Stephen is now called Dennis. That's how he refers to himself for the next 7 years. That's how he is introduced to other people, to his friends. Everybody knows Stephen as Dennis, and his identity is kind of wiped. So the next day, Parnell drives Murphy back to the lodge, which is where Murphy lives, and he actually hands in his notice at the lodge, and he returns to the cabin where he abuses Stephen again. In fact, the abuse is becoming more frequent. It's intensifying. And 13 days after Parnell first kidnapped Stephen is when he first sodomized him. When Parnell finished doing what he did to Stephen, Stephen was in agony. He was crying in pain. He was terrified. Like I say, this is just his new normal from now on. For the next 7 years, living with Parnell, this is kind of how his life is. Constant abuse, constant pain. The next morning, Parnell actually traded in his Buick, and then they left the cabin. They left Kathy's Valley. They actually drove 200 miles away to Santa Rosa, and they spent the next few weeks checking into motels. Obviously, the abuse continued. Any connection to the kidnapping was kind of being eradicated. You know, Stephen's identity was changed. The car was changed. They were now 200 miles away in Santa Rosa. And dirty, cheap motels is where Steven Stayner spent his first Christmas away from home. Back home, the Christmas present that he'd told Santa that he wanted lay lying under the tree, waiting for him. So back home, during the period that Stephen had been away for, obviously his parents were frantic. Now, on the day that Stephen actually disappeared, Kay had actually driven to the school to pick Stephen up, but she ended up being 10 minutes late because she was doing something else on the way. By the time she got to the school, Stephen wasn't there. So she went straight home, and obviously Stephen wasn't there. I think initially neither her nor Delbert were too overly concerned about it, because do you remember when I said that Stephen had this habit of kind of going to other friends' houses after school, and Delbert would give him a whooping for it? I think they were kind of thinking that at first. They just thought that he'd gone to a friend's house. But obviously time ticked on, and it got later and later, and there was no sign of Stephen. They checked with Sharon's parents, because it was obviously Sharon's birthday, so maybe he'd gone there, but she hadn't seen him. And about 5 p.m, they contacted the Merced police. And that night, a search took place. The police were helped by the local Boy Scouts. People went out checking. They were sort of walking the streets, checking sheds, gardens, woods, whatever areas that they thought Stephen could be lying hurt, injured. I think that was the thought process. So they were checking any areas where he could be lying injured. Basically, the whole neighbourhood was out kind of helping and canvassing and just walking the streets, doing what they could. In fact, and you're not going to believe this, but Delbert went to Cathy's Valley, to the trailer park Stephen was at, because Stephen's grandfather lived at the trailer park. He was literally a few caravans down from the cabin where his grandson had been kidnapped. So Delbert went to the same trailer park that Stephen was at. It kind of makes it worse somehow. It makes the story worse because he was right there. But poor old Delbert, he didn't take what was going on very well at all. He was driving around, and I think in the back of his mind, he was beginning to think that his son had been murdered. And he was driving around looking for mounds of dirt in the ground, looking for places where a body could be buried. He was driving around with a gun in the car, thinking that if he saw somebody, digging something, he was armed and ready. So anyway, this search went on for a few days. Kay and Delbert helped the police in any way they could. They took lie detector tests. They even woke up one morning to find the police excavating their garden in case Stephen had been, buried in their backyard. It's just horrible to think what these poor parents were going through. Can you even imagine that? Imagine, you're being questioned to see if you've murdered your own child, and then you see the diggers in your garden. His parents did everything. His mother, she was the one with the neighbourhood. They printed these missing posters. So that poster that Parnell had seen was actually something that Kay had done. Kay was terrified of leaving the house, so whilst Delbert was out looking for his son with a shotgun on his car seat, Kay stayed at the house in case Stephen came back, in case Stephen called the landline, just in case she didn't leave the house. One interesting thing is that a number of psychics became involved. Obviously, people have different opinions of psychics. It's a difficult one because, on the whole, I'm kind of pro-psychics. But there's not much evidence that they've actually done very much to help. But what's interesting with this one particular psychic that got involved, I mean, the police, I think at this point, they were kind of following any leads that they could. So whilst I don't think the police are particularly pro-psychics, I think they were just kind of grabbing onto anything. And there's this one psychic that actually led the police up to the trailer park at Cathy's Valley. She led them to the cabin. Now, I don't know whether this was just luck, fluke, whether this was a psychic ability. I don't know. But she took the police there. And what happened was, because like I said, the grandfather lived there, everyone just assumed that the psychic kind of link that she was getting was because of the grandfather being there. So nobody checked the cabin. Nobody checked it. But obviously the police kind of followed up with the grandfather, and he was checked and he passed the polygraph and all this stuff. Apparently he wasn't very cooperative actually with the police, which, well, it sounds a bit weird to me that he wasn't cooperative. His grandson was missing. But, there was nothing dodgy going on with the grandfather, so they left the trailer park. Now, the other infuriating thing about this case, there's going to be a lot of infuriating things about this case, but because of the proximity to Yosemite National Park, and that's where, don't forget, Parnell and Murphy worked at the lodge at Yosemite Park, the police actually requested a list of employees working at the park at the time. And the guy that was kind of in charge of law enforcement, he wasn't particularly helpful. And the reason they asked for this list is because Yosemite National Park was kind of renowned for taking in, how should we say it, kind of undesirables. People that wanted to kind of stay off the grid, people that had been in trouble with the law. Those kind of people were the kind of people that worked at the park. Not wanting to generalise everybody that worked at the park, but they had quite a lot of those kind of people there. And so they asked for this list. So not only did this list arrive late, the names that were on this list were only 50% complete. So only 50% of the employees that worked there were on the list. And this was something to do with the fact that the employees were paid fortnightly. And so the week that Parnell was working was the week that he was missed off this list. On top of that, the Rangers did carry out a search of the park. Stephen was there. So again, they missed him. But they carried out this search. And like I said, the man kind of in charge, he was less than cooperative. And so when the FBI visited the park and said, can you put up these posters of this missing child? The manager said no, because he didn't want to scare the clientele away. Can you believe that? A child has gone missing and he doesn't want to freak out his guests, so he doesn't put up this poster. The manager actually argued with the FBI that a warrant would be needed to put up this poster because the park fell under federal jurisdiction rather than local jurisdiction, and so a warrant would be needed. So nobody ever saw a poster. Nobody saw a poster of missing Steven Stayner at the park where he was being held by a paedophile. Marvellous. So about a week after Stephen goes missing, around about the 11th of December, the search was actually called off. The Stayner family were absolutely devastated because nobody was really looking anymore. Obviously the family still were, but officially the search had been called off, and they spent Christmas without their son, unaware that he was staying in these crappy motels with a paedophile. And they were going through it. At one point, I think a cowboy boot had washed up along the river somewhere, and they thought it might be Stephen, but it was nothing to do with Stephen. But this was the kind of anxiety and agony that the family had to go through, kind of, is this body, this piece of clothing, whatever, that washes up, is this our child? Where is our child? And this went on for 7 years. So the family were all going through it. Don't forget, Stephen had 4 brothers and sisters, and the whole family were in turmoil. I think the kids were a little bit neglected because Delbert and Kay, all their attention was going into finding Stephen, so not as much attention was going on the other children. So they were all suffering. The whole family was going through the agony of Stephen missing, including Carrie, who I am going to cover in another video, as I've said. But there is one point with Carrie where, how I said Stephen was kind of a little bit unruly. Stephen had written his name on the garage door. He'd kind of graffitied the garage door with his name. And I think Carrie went to cover it up, and Dell went ballistic. This is something with Carrie later on that, he kind of felt the force of Delbert's anger and frustration. Yeah, the whole family spent the next 7 years not knowing what had happened to Stephen, and not knowing whether Stephen was alive or dead. But they didn't stop looking. Stephen was very much loved, very much missed, and still searched for. After Christmas, Parnell gets a job at the Holiday Inn in Santa Rosa. He's kind of a bookkeeper / alternating front desk clerk. So whilst Parnell is working, he actually hires babysitters to look after Stephen. This is where he is literally hiding Stephen in plain sight. He's not even holding him in captivity. When you think of somebody kidnapping a child, you think of them being locked in a room, tied up somewhere, unable to physically escape. Stephen could escape any time, but he didn't, because he was 7, and where would he go? Besides which, this mental manipulation, that's what I keep going back to, but it was very, very much mental manipulation. And Parnell had told Stephen that if he tried to leave, he would end up in a children's home. And, Stephen believed him, because as far as Stephen was aware, his parents didn't want him. Where would he go? And that's kind of why he ended up staying with Parnell for as long as he did, despite the fact that he wasn't physically in captivity, physically tied up. He was living a normal life in between the abuse. And this, I keep saying normal life, but you know what I mean. I mean, it is normal life. Parnell enrolls Stephen at school. He goes to school. Obviously, he's got the different name. He's called Dennis. Don't forget, he's not Stephen anymore. He is Dennis Parnell. But the unbelievable thing about this is he doesn't have any paperwork. There is no paperwork. And somehow, Parnell, he manages to manipulate everybody. He puts off getting the paperwork. He's like, oh yeah, it's coming from the other school that Stephen used to go to. But what's unbelievable is that the school doesn't follow up. They didn't even ask for a birth certificate. In fact, the school that Stephen was going to, Steel Lane Elementary, the school district received a number of the missing child posters, the posters that Kay had done. These were sent to the school district to be handed out to the schools. And whoever was in the office at the school district, they threw the flyers out. They didn't hand them to the schools. They threw the frickin' flyers out. Hence why the staff at the school didn't recognise Stephen as a missing child. He looked different. He was given a new name. Poor Stephen, once again, he had to get used to having new friends. He'd just begun to settle when he moved to Betty Street. And not long after kind of coming to terms with his new life in Betty Street, he had to come to terms with a new life at this new school. But he wasn't there for very long, because a month or two later, Parnell kind of finds a trailer for them to move into, and Stephen ends up moving schools again. And the same thing happened with the paperwork, except this time, obviously, it's beginning to take root, because he could kind of quote the last school, the Steel Lane School, as being somewhere that Stephen went to. And this new school could kind of check up with that school, even though he was only there for a few weeks. The paperwork was beginning to kind of take root, I guess. And Parnell was beginning to establish a paper trail for Dennis Parnell. So come April, Stephen, he turns 8. It's his birthday in April. But Parnell's abuse is continuing. There's no sign of that stopping. And one night, Stephen does actually try to make a break from the trailer. When Parnell is sleeping, Stephen leaves in the middle of the night and kind of goes down the road wanting to go home. But Stephen's 8. He thinks his parents don't want him. He has no idea where he is. He hasn't got a clue where he is. He doesn't know where to go. He doesn't know what to do. And he's terrified. And he actually goes back to the trailer before Parnell wakes up and realises that he's gone, so that he doesn't get into trouble. And he goes back to the trailer and back to Parnell. Parnell's manipulation has well and truly taken root in Stephen now. I mean, it's only been a few months, but Stephen believes it and he's got nowhere to go. It was just an all-round manipulation. And poor Stephen, he apparently scoured, news broadcasts and newspapers, trying to find anything to see if his parents did still want him. Even though this manipulation had taken root and he believed it, there was obviously something in the back of his mind that was still wanting desperately to believe that it wasn't true and that his parents were looking for him, which they were, but unfortunately, unbeknown to him, they really were. So obviously he's gone back to the trailer and he's kind of accepting, I guess, that this is his life now. And he does actually begin to make new friends. He doesn't mind the trailer too much. He likes the outdoor life, so he likes playing outside, and he loves Queenie, his little dog. So, he's beginning to kind of settle a little bit. And like I say, he's making new friends. And one friend he makes is called Kenny Matthias. And their friendship kind of developed, and Stephen would stay at Kenny's house quite a bit. I mean, even through all this, he still doesn't say anything. I guess what's he going to say? Who's going to believe him? That's what he's thinking, not what I'm thinking, but that's what he's thinking. But Parnell kind of uses this opportunity to get to other boys. As we go through this story, it'll become very evident that it's not just Stephen that Parnell abuses. He's got this boy that he can have access to at any time he wants, but he also can use the boy that he's got to get access to Stephen's friends, which he does. He becomes friends with Kenny's mother, Barbara Matthias, and he actually asks Barbara to babysit Stephen on occasion, which she agrees to. And over time, they kind of develop a relationship. So she becomes a little bit more than just a babysitter. Now, I don't know whether this relationship that Parnell develops with Barbara is purely manipulation, purely to make it look like he has a relationship with a woman, or whether, it was a genuine relationship. I don't really know. I suspect it's kind of more manipulation, knowing the way Parnell operates. But regardless, they kind of entered into a relationship with each other. And whilst Parnell was kind of beginning to integrate himself into the Matthias's life, things were kind of going on as normal back home. At one point, Stephen became really, really sick, so sick that he needed a doctor. And Parnell took him to the doctor. And Parnell had no paperwork even for Stephen at the doctor. But still, Stephen got treatment and still nobody noticed. Despite there being no paperwork, nobody cottoned on that this was a missing kid. Stephen was literally being hidden in plain sight. He had friends. He was going to his friends' houses. He was going to school. He was going to restaurants. He was going to the doctors. I think at some point later on, not when he's 8, but he's a little bit older, he even gets not arrested, but kind of taken in by the police because he was caught shoplifting. Still, even though he's talking to a policeman and the police visited Parnell, he still doesn't say anything. Early in the next year, so this was February 1974, Parnell lost his job at the Holiday Inn and he took a job delivering newspapers. Now, financially, this is a major step down and they ended up staying back in motels again, I think, in Santa Rosa. Stephen, though, was able to kind of go back to his old school and stay friends with Kenny. And by the spring, Parnell found a new job and with Stephen still having this friendship with Kenny, Parnell's and Barbara's relationship intensified. And apparently, Barbara's relationship with her husband or boyfriend, it was an abusive one. And he apparently was an alcoholic and would beat her. So Barbara was getting closer and closer to Parnell. And even though Parnell was living in motel rooms again at this point, she moved in with them to a motel room. So to set the scene a little bit, this is a motel room with one bed, which Parnell and Stephen are sharing. Parnell asks Barbara to move in. So the three of them were sharing a bed, 2 adults and Stephen, who is, I think he's possibly 9 at this point. He's 8 or 9. And one night, Parnell and Barbara begin to have sex in front of Stephen. And Parnell forces Stephen to join them and have sex. He's 9 and now having sex with not just Parnell, but Barbara Matthias as well. And this continued. I think Parnell, he gets, or he's able to resume his job back at the Holiday Inn. He's able to work anyway, and so they get another trailer. But again, it's a 1-room trailer or cabin, whatever. It's 1 room, 1 bed, and Barbara's now with them. So they're all sharing. And Stephen would say that during that 18 months that they were all together, that he was raped by both of them another 8 times. But equally, oh God, this is sick. But equally, obviously he hated having sex with both of them. Equally, he was kind of pleased that Barbara was there because it meant that there was less attention on him. So even though he was raped like 8 times by them both, Barbara's presence kind of meant that Parnell wasn't abusing him quite as much. I mean, he still was, but it wasn't as much as it was before. So you know how I said that Parnell was abusing other boys during that 7 years? Well, he did actually try to abduct another boy in 1974. He actually roped Stephen into his plan. He drove Stephen to a shopping mall and made Stephen approach other young boys. Obviously, Parnell, just like Murphy, he was kind of standing back and just watching the interaction. So he didn't know what Stephen was actually saying to the boys, but he assumed that Stephen was trying to convince them to go with him. But Stephen wasn't. He was foiling the plan. So he was pretending to be part of it, but he wasn't. And then he would go back to Parnell and just say, no, they refused to come with me. So yeah, bless Stephen. He wasn't going to rope somebody else into the abuse that he was going through. A few months later, Parnell actually roped Barbara into trying, and I believe they did actually almost successfully get a child. The child got as far as the car, but then he ran away. After this incident, they needed to get away because this kid could say anything. So they actually ended up moving 80 miles away. And Stephen was made to change schools yet again. And Parnell couldn't find any work. And so they ended up moving again. So it was less than a month later, they moved to another trailer park in Fort Bragg. And actually, at this place, Parnell was able to get some financial assistance from his mother. And he actually ended up opening a Bible shop. I assume that means he sold Bibles, being the really good, God-fearing man that he was. But yeah, so he set up this Bible store with the help of his mother's money, and Stephen changed schools again. And this is how brazen he was. He actually, at this new school that they were enlisting Stephen into, they actually listed Barbara on the paperwork as Stephen's mother. I'm guessing the paper trail was kind of established by this point. So anyway, the Bible store, it was a failure and ended up closing. So by the spring of 1976, Barbara, she gained custody of her 4 children, including Kenny. So she moved the 4 of them in. Now there were 7 of them living together, and the trailer was obviously way too small. So Parnell ended up purchasing a converted school bus. So all 7 of them ended up living in this school bus. And they actually had to move again because the trailer park that they were on wouldn't allow this bus. So they ended up moving to a different trailer park. And it was actually here that Kenny informed Stephen that Parnell, who Kenny thought was Stephen's father, had tried to molest him. I don't know whether Stephen was embarrassed, whether he just couldn't cope with it, whether it was too close to home and it would mean talking about himself. I'm not sure why, but he kind of ignored him. But it's pretty evident that Parnell is abusing other boys. Obviously, with what happened with Parnell wanting Stephen to assist him in kidnapping another boy, and with Kenny's accusation, Stephen's becoming pretty aware of it too. And I think that's important later on down the line. He might be ignoring it to some degree because for whatever reason he can't cope with it himself. And that's very often the case actually in kind of abuse cases where people deal with it themselves. They kind of keep their head in the sand in a way and just carry on as if nothing's happening. But it's only when something happens, when it looks like the abuse might go further than themselves, that people become kind of triggered into doing something about it, which you'll see later on is kind of very much the case with Stephen. But for now, he's kind of just keeping his head in the sand, I guess. But anyway, with 7 people living in this bus, there was a financial strain that was really taking a toll on Barbara and Parnell, and their relationship was becoming strained. And so by the June of that year, Barbara actually took her children and went to live with another man. I don't know where this other man pops up from. Yeah, it went back to being Parnell and Stephen. And as you can imagine, the abuse intensified. So Parnell, he gets a new job as a bookkeeper at some kind of dental supply company. And they were able to rent another mobile home, which I think Parnell managed to get from one of his new colleagues, and this was in Comptia. And Stephen actually loved it there because he had his own bedroom. So, of course, he loved it. He had his own bedroom away from bloody Parnell. Not that the abuse stopped, but, you know, he had his own space. And Stephen's now 12 at this point. And I think for the first time since Stephen has been with Parnell, he's beginning to actually properly make some roots and properly become happy. I mean, yeah, this abuse was going on, but aside from the abuse, he was relatively happy there. He had his friends, he had his girlfriend. He was, however, taking drugs recreationally, marijuana. I don't think Parnell allowed it per se, but he was just a lot more easygoing. I mean, Stephen could never have got away with that if he was still with Kay and Dale. But the only issue is that Parnell still had this roving eye for other boys. And Parnell himself would invite Stephen's friends to the trailer. I think Stephen sometimes knew about it. Other times, Parnell made sure that Stephen was going to be away or staying at a friend's house. And again, he tried it with Kenny. He had invited Kenny over, Kenny thinking Stephen was going to be at the trailer, and Stephen wasn't at the trailer because Parnell had sent him off somewhere. And once again, Parnell tried to molest Kenny, but Kenny got away again. He did tell Stephen again, and again, Stephen kind of, you know, ignored it. From the outside looking in, it's really difficult to understand, but it does make sense. You know, if that's all you know, if that's the only life that you know, by telling on the person who he considered his dad, and then his dad being arrested, going to prison, Stephen had nobody. So even though it's difficult to kind of stomach, it does make sense. In another incident, Barbara actually visited Parnell, and for some reason she went off. She took her kids, apart from Kenny and her 9-year-old son. I don't know what she was doing, shopping maybe, I'm not sure. But she went off and left Kenny and the 9-year-old alone at the trailer with Parnell. And Parnell tried to abuse them both. Kenny actually ran away, leaving the 9-year-old behind. And allegedly the 9-year-old was raped. Parnell tried it on with a few of Stephen's friends, not just Kenny. There was a time that he offered money to a 10-year-old. The 10-year-old declined, thankfully. But another boy, another friend of Stephen's called George, Parnell got Stephen and George drunk one night. And according to the police report that was filed by George's mother at the time, Parnell sodomised George. Parnell had also taken nude photographs of Stephen, and it wasn't just Stephen, it was his friends as well. In another incident where later on the police actually found some of the photographs, there was another boy in one of these photographs, and it was of Stephen and this boy, Jeff, together in the shower. Again, Parnell had got them drunk and they were taking nude photographs. I'm not sure anything sexual as such was happening. I think it might have just been nudes, but regardless, I mean, God's sake, who cares? He got two boys drunk and took pictures of them, explicit pictures of them. I guess around this time, I mean, Steven is now a teenager. He's either becoming a teenager or just become a teenager. He's around that age. He's 13 roughly. And this is a time where any child, regardless of your upbringing, you start questioning yourself. You're developing and you're trying to work out who you are as a person. And it was no different for Steven. But he had all this stuff going on with Parnell and he was questioning it. And even though Parnell's manipulation had put the fear of God in him to not want to leave and not want to be on his own because he thought he had no one else, there was obviously something in the back of his mind. I think I've touched on this before. There's something in the back where he knows deep down that what's going on isn't right. And I think he's at a party one night with his friends. I think Kenny's there, and I think Laurie, his girlfriend, is there. Steven was taking marijuana and he got drunk at this party. And he began to cry. I mean, obviously, you know, he had alcohol and drugs and emotions, being a teenager, kind of going everywhere. And he got drunk at this party and he began to cry. And whatever he would normally be able to kind of hold in, I think was kind of bubbling away and starting to bubble to the surface. Because at this party, he told his friends, he told them that his real name wasn't Dennis and that it was Steven. And he also said that he wanted to go back to his real home. Now, his friends, they had no idea what he was on about. And obviously, they just thought it was the drink and the drugs. But in later interviews, they bring it up. And I think, you know, it's a big regret for them that they didn't really realise what was going on. But emotionally for Steven, clearly things are coming out. He's finding it more difficult, I imagine, with all the emotions going through him just naturally as a teenager. He's finding it difficult to kind of keep in control of how he's feeling. Obviously, with Steven becoming a teenager, he's developing from a boy into a man. And Parnell likes little boys, you know. And Steven's development is not great news for him. Not just sexually, but I think Parnell knew that there would come a time when Steven he'd want to leave, he'd want to get work, he'd want to get a family, you know, all those things. He would be leaving. Parnell's time for keeping this under wraps was kind of getting shorter. You know, there wasn't much longer that he could go on with this facade for. And Steven would also need paperwork. I think he talked about joining the police, and Steven would need paperwork for something like that. So Parnell knew that things were coming to an end. And then, like I say, sexually, he needed another little boy to replace Steven. So by the spring of 1979, Parnell had put down a deposit on a piece of land in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. And his plan was to eventually build himself a cabin there. He would, in the meantime, live in a trailer on this piece of land until he was able to build himself a cabin. So it was going to take a few weeks for the paperwork to come through, for the land deal paperwork, whatever you need to buy a piece of land. It was going to take a few weeks for that to come through. So he took Steven and moved to another cabin. So this cabin was on Mountain View Ranch and it was in Manchester. And he had some kind of deal going on with the landowner there that he could stay in this cabin rent-free, but he would look after the land there because I think the owners grew cannabis. So Parnell will basically keep an eye out for trespassers and whatnot. And like I say, it was just a temporary move until he could move to Arkansas and have this piece of land that was his own and then eventually build a cabin. But this move to Mountain View Ranch, it was very sudden, and Steven was not happy at all because he had built some major roots, you know, in the last place, And he had his friends, he had his girlfriend, he was happy there. He enjoyed it, he liked it. They were there for 3 years, and I think that's the longest that Stephen had been anywhere, 3 whole years, because this moving around, I know they're moving around a lot, and you're probably thinking, why am I telling you all this moving around? Well, it's important, all this moving around, because it's part of Parnell's manipulation. It's part of making sure that Stephen doesn't build roots anywhere, that Stephen feels unsettled permanently. And it's part of the reason why he doesn't leave. He doesn't leave Parnell. He doesn't say anything about Parnell because he's unsettled. Nowhere is secure for him. So all these moves are important to know about. So you can imagine he was in Comcha for 3 years. So this sudden, it was very much in the night, I think. It was a very sudden thing. We don't know why exactly Parnell just like that decided to uproot and leave. But whether part of it perhaps was sort of this, Stephen, like I said, he was growing up and there was this uncertainty about how much longer Stephen would keep quiet for. He up and left, and they ended up in this cabin in Manchester. And this new cabin, it was basic. It was really basic. I don't think there was any electricity. Wash facilities were outside. I think there was just one room. It was kind of like going back to the initial cabins. It was really basic. So Parnell gets a job at a hotel, the Palace Hotel in Ukiah. He's working night times. He's a night desk clerk, I think, and he possibly does security and bits and bobs. But he's working night times at this hotel, and their cabin is really, really rural. It's really kind of in the middle of nowhere. And Ukiah is actually 30 miles away, so it's a long trek away. And Parnell goes to this job every night. And equally, Stephen has to go to a new school, but because of how rural their location is, he's starting to not go to school. He just doesn't bother. It's so far away. He does go, but he's absent more than he's there. Now, Parnell is still molesting Stephen. But Stephen's 14 by this point, and the abuse has decreased quite a lot. Parnell just doesn't have that same kind of, the same inclination towards a really old 14-year-old. So this desire to kidnap another boy, it's getting more and more. It's becoming kind of, for Parnell, it's at desperation point. And I think Parnell's plan was, with this new place in Arkansas, the new cabin that he was building or going to build, I think it was going to be like a Stephen Point 2. So he was going to start again with a new child, a new little boy, and it would be like Stephen all over again in a new place. So Parnell did actually attempt a few times to take another boy, and I think he even roped Stephen in to help him again. Well, I'll say help loosely, because Stephen didn't help him. He didn't know that, but Stephen didn't. But obviously each time Parnell was unsuccessful at kidnapping another boy. And Parnell needed to manipulate somebody else, just as he had with Murphy, because of course he didn't really get involved himself. He was very clever to not be seen kidnapping a child. So he needed somebody else to help him. Now, this is where a young lad called Sean Porman comes into the picture. Now, Sean was a troubled teenager. He was friends with Stephen, but not friends. You know how kids they just know each other. They go to the same schools and they kind of know each other. So Stephen and Sean were familiar with each other. But he was a troubled lad. He had a volatile home situation. And basically it was something that Parnell, being the great manipulator, he was able to take advantage of. And he used cigarettes, drugs, alcohol, whatever, to take advantage of Sean. He also used Sean to sell some of the marijuana that he had stolen from this ranch that he was staying on, that he was meant to be looking after the marijuana there. and making sure nobody was stealing it. He was stealing it, but getting Sean to sell this marijuana for him. So by November 1979, Sean was staying at the cabin with Steven and Parnell, and Parnell began to tell Sean about his desire for a young child. Just like he'd done with Murphy, he told Sean that he wanted a child to look after, he wanted a son, he wanted to help him. And he offered Sean $50 to help him get a child. And Sean agreed. So on February the 14th, 1980, Sean and Parnell drove to Ukiah Elementary School in Ukiah, and they watched the kindergartners leaving the school. Now, Parnell had already had his eye on a boy. He'd watched them already, so he kind of knew which boy he wanted. But they couldn't spot him. For some reason, they didn't see him. Parnell obviously knew the route that this boy took after school. So because it was the morning, they would wait until after school for him to come out of school because they couldn't spot him in the morning. So in the meantime, whilst waiting, they went to some charity stores, picked up some bits and bobs that they would need, like, I don't know, sleeping pills, usual things like that when you're having a new child come into your home. I think he got a mattress and he got some children's clothes so that he could disguise the kid. He also bought girls' clothing, actually, because I think he was going to disguise the little boy as a girl. And he also bought Sean a briefcase, which was a reward for Sean for helping him. At about 11 a.m, so about 3 hours later, they returned to the kindergarten, because I guess this is a kindergarten, so the kids only stay kind of half a day. But yeah, this little boy was coming out and they spotted him. And they were poised and ready to put their plan into action. So the boy that Parnell had his eyes on was 5 years old. His name is Timmy White. It's February the 14th. It's Valentine's Day. And little Timmy White, he was happy leaving school. He was clutching a little Valentine's bag with all these little goodies in. I think the class had kind of made cards and things like that. And he left the class clutching his little bag of Valentine's cards. And he was also wearing, bless him, he was also wearing a cowboy costume because they were able to dress up for the day. And instead of going as something romantic, little Timmy had decided to dress up as a cowboy. So he's walking down the street, going home. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what on earth, where are his parents? He's 5 years old. And today, that's the natural thing to think. But it was quite common back in the 70s to walk around on your own. I don't want to say it wasn't as dangerous as it is today, because I think it probably was. But people didn't know about it. You didn't have social media. And even though it probably wasn't particularly safer as such, it felt safer. So 5-year-old Timmy was walking home alone. It wasn't far and he knew the route. I want to say he would have been fine, but he obviously wasn't fine, because as he's walking down the road, he is coming towards a car, Parnell's car, and crouched by the side of the car was a teenager who was Sean Pullman. To Timmy, it looked like Sean was fixing the tyre of the car, which Sean was pretending to do. So Sean called over to Timmy and asked Timmy for his help in fixing this tyre. Now, Timmy was a streetwise little kid, because he instantly refused and carried on his way and ignored what was going on. But suddenly he heard the teenager, Sean, running up behind him. So Timmy began to run as well. He ran as fast as his little legs would carry him. He was only little, he was 5. It didn't take long for Sean to catch up to him. But Timmy was a fighter. He grabbed onto like a chain fence and he grabbed hold of it. He had it tight. And Sean was like yanking this little boy, desperately trying to get him in the car. And Timmy put up quite a struggle holding on to this fence. Eventually, he couldn't carry on holding. Eventually, he did let go, and Sean carried him and threw him in the car. But all the while, Timmy was kicking and screaming and shouting, and he was putting up a real fight. Obviously, he was no match for a teenager. He just wasn't. So Timmy was thrown onto the back seat of this car, and very quickly Sean subdued him and forced him to swallow these sleeping pills that they'd purchased earlier in the day. Timmy was absolutely terrified, obviously, but, together with the sleeping pills, and he had a blanket thrown over the top of him as well, he kind of lay on the back seat, petrified and without a clue as to where these strange men were taking him. It was quite a different scenario, actually, to Stephen. Stephen got into the car of his own accord, and even though he was scared, he didn't have that same terror that's going through Timmy, who was literally abducted off the street. So when Parnell and Sean arrived back at the cabin in Manchester, they carried a sleepy Timmy inside. They changed him into charity shop pyjamas and gave him some more sleeping pills and let him sleep it off on the bed. Parnell gave Sean, as a souvenir of the day, some nude photographs of some of his classmates. I'm not saying anything. And some marijuana and some whiskey, I think, some kind of alcohol. And he also gave him some photographs of the intersection where they kidnapped Timmy, so that he could truly remember the day. Okay. And so Sean left the cabin and he never went back there again. Now, Stephen's got no idea what had taken place. So later that day, Parnell collects Stephen from school, and Stephen gets in the car, and on the back seat is Timmy White, his new baby brother. This is the first time Stephen finds out about Timmy, about his new brother. And Timmy is lying sedated, basically, on the back seat of the car. Now, Stephen is mortified. He is absolutely mortified. He sees this little 5-year-old and he knows exactly what is going to happen to him. And he knows because it happened to him. And like I say, very often sexual abuse is kept hidden, but something like having to protect others from the abuser is very often a trigger to doing something about it. Timmy White was Stephen's trigger. He couldn't let what happened to him happen to Timmy. For him, it would be a risk, a massive risk. He could lose everything, well, what little he's got. He would lose his father, he would lose a home, he would lose someone looking after him. He knew that he would have to do something. So little Timmy, he basically spent the first week at that cabin sedated. He was on sleeping pills for most of the time. By day, Stephen would go to school and Parnell would be at home looking after Timmy. And by night, Parnell had to go to his job at the Palace Hotel and Stephen would look after Timmy. I don't think with Timmy that Parnell started abusing him straight away. I think he was so little that he didn't quite start straight away. But Stephen, bless his heart, he knew obviously what was going to happen, and he was so anxious about Parnell abusing Timmy that he would return home from school at lunchtime just to check on Timmy. That's how terrified he was that this little boy was going to be abused, that he gave up his schooling just so that he could go home and make sure the kid was all right. And then about sort of 10 days after his kidnapping, Parnell did exactly the same thing, and he cut Timmy's hair, dyed Timmy's hair, and all this stuff going on. Painful emotions came flooding back for Stephen. All the past was just kind of coming out. It was only a matter of time before Stephen wouldn't be able to kind of hold it in much longer. And in between all this, he's desperately trying to care for this little boy. So Stephen hatches a plan. He's going to rescue Timmy. He's not going to let Parnell do to Timmy what happened to him. So Stephen's plan was basically to hitchhike with Timmy to Ukiah. Stephen is 14 at this point? Timmy is 5 years old at this point. So this 14-year-old is going to hitchhike 30, 40 miles away with a 5-year-old in the middle of the night. And then on top of this, Stephen planned on taking Timmy to Ukiah, dropping him off somewhere safe, hopefully the babysitter's house where he would usually go to. Drop him off in Ukiah, and then Stephen would hitchhike back to the cabin. This is all in the dead of night whilst Parnell's at work in Ukiah, and hopefully be home before Parnell would even realise anything was wrong. So, I mean, I'm guessing that the plan was that he could be at home and then be like, oh, whoops, I didn't realise the kids ran away or whatever. I don't know. But he was going to hitchhike with a 5-year-old 40 miles away, hitchhike home again so that he could be home before Parnell was, so that he wouldn't get into trouble. Or he also knew that he probably would get into trouble because even if he managed to convince Parnell that the kid ran away, he was going to get the whooping of his life from Parnell because he would have been in charge of Timmy at that point. So he was going to be in big trouble. And despite this, he was still determined to rescue Timmy. Stephen also knew that they were going to be moving to Arkansas soon. And that was a very long way away, and there was no way that Stephen would be able to hitchhike to Ukiah from this new cabin in Arkansas. So he had to act quickly. You're probably thinking, like I did, well, why on earth didn't Stephen just tell somebody, alert a teacher or something, say something, tell someone that his father had, what he had done. And like I say, it just goes back to this not wanting to dob his father in. He was just too scared of Parnell going to jail and being on his own. So that wasn't an option for him. So really, even though hitchhiking in the middle of the night, and this was stormy season as well, and 2 young lads getting into a stranger's car, despite all of that, this was the only option kind of open to Stephen at that point. So Stephen's first attempt was about a week after Timmy had been kidnapped, and they didn't get very far. The storms were so bad that Timmy was terrified. He was just screaming to go back again. He was absolutely terrified. We're talking thunder banging across the sky and lightning and all this stuff. It was torrential rain, and in the end, Stephen had to just lift Timmy onto his shoulders and carry him back to the cabin. They were both cold and wet and hadn't got anywhere. Luckily for them, though, Parnell remained oblivious to Stephen's rescue attempts and was busy preparing for Arkansas. And for Parnell, he wanted to get away as quickly as he could because there was actually a lot of media attention around the case. As you can imagine, back home in Ukiah, Timmy's parents, well, the same situation as Stephen's parents, they were going out of their mind, and there was a lot of media attention, the missing posters, all this stuff going on. And Parnell needs to get away. In fact, one night, the police actually visited the hotel that Parnell was working at. Parnell even spoke to the police and showed them the guest registry because the police were looking for anybody, acting suspiciously, and they were talking to the very man that they wanted. But once again, I mean, it's infuriating. So as I say, Parnell needs to get away really quickly, but his plan did not involve Stephen. Parnell had actually started digging a hole out the back of the cabin, 6 feet long, 3 feet deep. He wasn't going to be taking Stephen or Queenie with him. So Stephen did try again. He made another rescue attempt, and once again, the thunder and lightning and all that, the wet and the cold, freaked little Timmy out. But then on March the 1st, 1980, Stephen made his third rescue attempt. He waited for Parnell to go to work and then took Timmy out into the night. Now, luckily on this night, They hadn't gone for very far before a car actually turned up and they managed to get a lift. This car was being driven by a Mexican called Armando Gomez, and he didn't speak particularly lots of English. And luckily for Stephen and Timmy, he didn't get a lot out of them, from what he could understand anyway. And literally, he drove them both to Ukiah. When they arrived in Ukiah, however, Timmy was totally lost. He could not find the babysitter's house. It was dark, didn't have a clue where to go. Stephen obviously didn't have a clue where to go. They were exhausted. And on top of that, they were terrified because don't forget, Parnell works in Ukiah. He works at the Palace Hotel. So Stephen's absolutely terrified that he's going to somehow bump into Parnell. Plus, he needs to get back home and hitchhike back home before Parnell even realises he's gone. So they find a telephone box, and Stephen's able to get the address of the local police station. And so that's where they head to. So Stephen arrives at the police station. It's around about 11, 12 o'clock at night at this point, and he wants to get Timmy inside, and then he wants to get back, and he doesn't want to go in himself because he doesn't want to answer any questions. He doesn't want to talk about Parnell, get Parnell into trouble. He just wants to get back home before Parnell notices he's gone, make sure Timmy's safe. So he pushes Timmy towards the police station, kind of up the steps and through the door, and he's watching from a distance. And even now, even though he's got him all the way to Ukiah, he's still stood there wanting to make sure this little 5-year-old has got in safely and is actually talking to a policeman. So basically, Timmy is kind of approaching this police station, and he goes up, he pushes the door a tiny little bit, and he's terrified. He is absolutely terrified. He sees this big policeman inside, and Timmy legs it. He runs back out, down the steps, down the street, back into Stephen's arms. Inside, the policeman that Timmy had kind of clocked eyes with obviously noticed, and he's like, why is there well, he doesn't know he's 5, but a very small child coming into the police station and running away and going towards a teenager. So he spots the whole thing, and he's kind of curious. It's getting on for midnight at this time, and the police officer, he's suspicious. His curiosity is well and truly aroused at this point. So this officer is called Officer Bob Warner. He obviously sees what happens, but at the same time, he doesn't want to give chase and scare them both into running away. So he radios a colleague who's out on patrol and tells his colleague what he just saw and to drive up and to try and find out what's going on. So this colleague, Officer Van Voorhees, he does just that, and he kind of drives up and drives by their side and stops the 2 boys. And so this officer obviously questions the boys and finds out the little boy he's holding on to is Timmy White, the same boy that had gone missing 2 weeks beforehand and everybody was out desperately searching for. Now, obviously, you can imagine the attention then turns to Stephen because the officers have no idea who Stephen is. And as far as they're aware, Stephen has something to do with it. They don't know that Stephen's not kidnapped Timmy or an accomplice in some way. And so they insist on obviously taking Stephen inside. So Stephen was questioned, and this is actually where the famous line comes from. I know my first name is Stephen, which became a book and it became a movie because when the officers picked Stephen up, Stephen couldn't remember totally who he was, and he made a witness statement, and the first line of his statement was he didn't know who he was, but he knew that his name was Stephen. All through this, he was terrified of Parnell being arrested and being left alone or even getting into trouble with Parnell. So it took a lot of coaxing for Stephen to open up. But he did, and he told the officers where they could find Parnell. And Parnell was, he was only around the corner at the Palace Hotel anyway, but he was arrested. But when they took Parnell back to the police station, um, they actually forced Stephen into the same room as Parnell to identify him. He had to stand in front of Parnell and identify him. He couldn't even like look through a glass or anything, have it so that Parnell couldn't see him. He was actually forced into the same room as the man. It was horrible. To remember as well that he's told the police what's going on. So at this point, he knows that Parnell is going to be arrested. So from this point, he is convinced that he's going to be on his own at this point. As far as he's concerned, he's going to be going to a children's home or something. He thinks his parents don't want him. In fact, he was really worried about Delbert's health because do you remember way back when they were living on that almond ranch? He was suffering from some poor health and he'd slipped a disc. And apparently at that point, Stephen had actually seen his father kind of lying on the floor in agony. And he was only little at that point. He was sort of 5, 6 years old himself. And he thought that his father was having some kind of heart attack. And so he didn't know that it was just a slipped disc. And all these years, he thought his father might even be dead. He didn't even know if Delbert was alive because he thought he'd had some kind of heart attack back then. So he well and truly thought that he was kind of on his own at this point. So very quickly, Timmy's parents, well, his mother and his stepfather, they were called to the police station to go and get Timmy. Apparently, Timmy was so dishevelled looking, and of course he'd had his hair cut and dyed and had kind of been disguised. But apparently his mother, Angela, when she arrived at the police station, she didn't even recognise her own son. Now, I find this a little bit hard to believe, actually. The sources kind of say that she didn't realise it was him and fainted. I don't know. I don't know if I buy that, but we'll go with that because that's what everybody seems to say, but I don't know. Obviously, they did eventually, and everything was A-OK and happily ever after and all that. But that's thanks to Stephen. And Timmy was actually examined by a doctor and there were no signs of sexual abuse. Stephen literally, he did what he set out to do and stopped Timmy being abused. So Stephen really, really was a hero. So a search warrant was issued, and later that day, the police officers went back to that cabin in Manchester and they found the little bag of Valentine's cards, the one that Timmy was carrying when he was kidnapped, and his clothes. So it was pretty much a slam dunk that, Parnell had taken him. They had the evidence. But they actually drove Stephen to the cabin as well because Stephen went to pick up Queenie, because don't forget Queenie. And they drove back to the cabin. He left in the back of the patrol car. And, well, I was going to say never returned to the cabin again, but actually that's not true. As Dennis Parnell, he never returned to the cabin again. Later, he would return to the cabin just to kind of look around again. Not quite fond memories, but he was showing his parents around later, sort of where he'd been for the last 7 years. But as Dennis Parnell, he never returned to that cabin again. We say that Stephen was a hero because he absolutely was. But in a way, Timmy rescued Stephen. If Timmy hadn't come along, and thank God he didn't get hurt along the way, Stephen would, well, there was a grave in the back. Don't forget. I mean, it's easy to forget about the grave, but Timmy rescued Stephen as well. And the next day there was a press conference, and there Stephen and Timmy were kind of reunited, and Timmy ran up to Stephen and the camera flashes just went mad. And there's these pictures of Stephen and Timmy together, and it's literally the sweetest thing. It's like the two little boys, well, they're not both little boys, but the two boys that literally saved each other's lives.
Kind of got to like Timmy.
After the press conference, Stephen began the 240-mile trek back from Ukiah to Merced, back to his family home, back to the family who had missed him for the last 7 years. And when they got back to Betty Street, there were hundreds of people out on the streets waiting for Stephen's arrival. There was obviously the family, the friends, his friend Sharon, the neighbours, the camera flashes as he got out of that car. He was overwhelmed with the amount of press that was there waiting for this boy that was taken at 7 and returned as a 14-year-old. But through the crowds, Kay and Delbert pushed their way through. They run up to their son and gave him 7 years worth of hugs, basically. They had tears streaming down their faces. Everyone was overjoyed. So after 7 years of being away from home and living in the conditions that he was living in, I mean, don't forget these conditions that he was in. You know, he was literally going from home to home, never putting down roots. And he was staying in dirty, grotty motels, cabins, trailers, you know, no electricity in some places, no wash facilities, or the wash facilities were outside. And all of a sudden he was in this loving, warm home with fresh bed linen, and he was able to take hot baths and just physical home comforts that he now had, that he'd been lacking for the last 7 years. All the things that kind of you take for granted really on a daily basis, Stephen now had. Those were the physical things. Emotionally, things weren't great. He didn't know what to expect from Delbert, or whether Delbert would expect something physically from him. Parnell had basically told Stephen that what Parnell was doing to him was the normal father-son things. Obviously, they weren't normal father-son things, but now Stephen was in this predicament of, am I supposed to be doing these father-son things with this man? So emotionally, Stephen was having a really difficult time. On top of that, Stephen had denied being abused by Parnell. He still hadn't told the police up until this point. He was adamant that nothing had happened. It's difficult to understand now, but this was 1980. And it was a different time. Homosexuality was not as accepted as it is today. Even though Stephen obviously wasn't a homosexual, he was engaging in homosexual activities, and it was not something he felt comfortable admitting to. He did go through some brief counselling, but even then it was brief and he was denying it. He just did not open up about his ordeal at all. And weirdly as well, the family didn't think that he needed counselling. They were the kind of family that dealt with things themselves. When I was doing the research for Carrie Stayner, Stephen's brother, something came up in the research that suggests that there may have been sexual abuse running through the Stayner family. It did come up in court, and there is a possibility that there was some sexual abuse towards Stephen's sisters by Delbert. It's not totally relevant to this case because Stephen wasn't there at the time, but that anxiety towards his father possibly came from somewhere. And that could be a reason, but I don't know. I'm kind of speculating a little bit. If this wasn't something that was discussed in court, I wouldn't say anything, because you can't just go throwing around kind of accusations of abuse willy-nilly. But this is something that was discussed in court later on, not for Stephen's trial, but later on in Carrie's trial. According to the psychiatrist's report, the courts ordered Delbert into therapy for molesting his daughters. It's something that comes up. Abuse in the Stayner family by not just Delbert, by Kay's father as well, I believe. It's something that comes up as a thread that runs through the Stayner family, let's say. So when Stephen's parents didn't want Stephen to get counselling, this is sort of one thing that comes up as a reason why, potentially, because they didn't want any dirty washing to be kind of out there. But that's just sort of, I don't know, Again, speculative. But counselling wasn't really an option for Stephen. And the relationship between Stephen and his father did remain strained. Also strained was the relationship between Stephen and his brother. They had to share a room. Stephen was getting all the attention. I mean, the last 7 years, Stephen, even though he wasn't there, was getting all the attention. And now he was home, he was still getting all the attention. And so there was strain between Kerry and Stephen as well. So on March the 3rd, Stephen was questioned again by the police and he gave the details of Murphy. And on the 4th, Murphy was arrested at the Yosemite Lodge where he worked. And actually, do you remember the manager who refused to put up the missing posters of Stephen? He was actually there and watched Murphy being carted away in handcuffs. Anyway, so on the 5th, Murphy appeared before court and he pleaded not guilty to the charge of kidnapping. And his bail was set at $50,000, which, get this, was $30,000 more than the bail set for Parnell. So all this time, obviously, the media is dubbing Stephen a hero, which he was. They do various media appearances, Good Morning America, things like that.
To police and your parents, obviously you just disappeared off the face of the map. What happened that afternoon? Do you remember when you were walking home from school?
Yes, I was walking home from school and I was stopped by a man along the street just a few blocks from my house, and he asked me if I wanted to, me or my mother wanted to donate something to a church, and I had told him that my mother would probably want to, and so he offered me a ride home. I had refused the first time, telling him that my house is just a few blocks away, and he had asked me several more times, and after a while I had taken the ride. And then a car pulled up, and I got in, and they passed the road that I lived on, and I had told them that was the road I lived on. They said that we'll just call your parents to see if you can stay the night.
Were you afraid?
Not that much. I was a little bit.
What did they tell you as the days went on? Why they were keeping you with them, and what did they tell you about your family?
Well, the first night they had said they called my parents and said it was all right that I stayed the night. The second night they said that they had called them again and said that I could stay another night. Then when I went out and came back and said that he went to court and he got in possession of me and said that I was his.
So when Timmy had been missing, there was actually a $15,000 reward out for information regarding Timmy. And because of what Stephen had done, the way that he had rescued Timmy, it was decided that Stephen would get the reward money. And so around Easter time, there was a reward ceremony where Stephen would pick up this reward money. And once again, he and Timmy were kind of reunited. And this is where, because they'd travelled down to Ukiah, this is where I was saying earlier that Stephen had kind of showed his parents around. So they'd already kind of gone off to Ukiah. So he continued to kind of show his parents around a little bit, where he'd been for the last 7 years, introduced him to some of his friends. And his parents kind of saw the squalor that Stephen had been living in for the last 7 years. So after the Easter break, Stephen enrolled in Merced High School, And the media were still relentlessly pursuing him. They were following him around the school. I mean, this was a different time completely because the reporters were in the school. They were in his classroom. That's just crazy to think. That just would not happen now. But they were literally following him around the school. And it wasn't just the press that was hounding him, but the kids at the high school. Now, this is horrific. This is horrible. But the kids at the high school, they bullied Stephen because the news got out that Parnell, what Parnell had done to Stephen. And because of that, even though Stephen had no choice, he was abused. He was bullied for being a homosexual. I don't even know what to say because I'm trying to be understanding of the fact that it's a different time, but still, there's no justification. Kids can be really freaking cruel sometimes. And Stephen had been through 7 years of hell, rescued a 5-year-old, and then he goes back to school to live this normal life. And instead of having a normal life, he is bullied for being homosexual. I mean, he's not even a homosexual, but, as if he was, and for having that abuse. Oh God, I don't even know what to say because it's horrible. It's just kids can be so bloody awful. They really can. And this is all in part because of the media's fault. They were hounding him and they were constantly bombarding him with these questions, wanting to know what Parnell had done to him. Their relentless questioning and speculation over what Parnell had done led to this bullying that he was getting in the school. Stephen had only been back at the school about 4 days and he got into an altercation with another boy who was constantly taunting him. In the end, Stephen punched him in the face. Now, I'm not kind of condoning violence at all. I kind of secretly want to say this kid deserved it, or equally, I don't condone punching someone in the face, but it's understandable that Stephen raged and punched this kid and he ended up being suspended from school. I mean, Stephen was suspended from school. I say that the principal was really sympathetic to Stephen. And I think more than a suspension, it was kind of a suggestion that he takes some time off school. So that's what he did. But it was still Stephen that ended up kind of having to take the time off school. So this is where I get angry again. So the police turn up and they basically tell Stephen that they found these Polaroids. The Polaroids of Stephen and this other kid in the shower together. Because Stephen still was denying any abuse by Parnell. He still wasn't openly admitting it. I mean, why would he? I mean, look at what the kids at school were doing to him. It's not something he could openly talk about. But the police had found these Polaroids. And Stephen was left with no choice but to admit what Parnell had done to him. And these Polaroids are pretty damn good evidence, right? But no. What happens later is that they can't use these Polaroids because they weren't found by the police. They were actually taken by the reporters that had gone into the cabin and were mooching around. They discovered these Polaroids and then handed them into the police. So by this point, they were kind of tainted evidence. They couldn't be used. What kind of police are those that don't secure a crime scene and let reporters take pictures that are in the crime scene of naked children? I mean, imagine if this reporter didn't even hand what he'd found to the police. So anyway, Stephen was kind of forced into a corner, I guess, at this point. He couldn't deny the abuse any longer. And as a result, emotionally, things got worse for him. He wasn't getting the counselling, the emotional, mental help that he needed. Living with Parnell, don't forget, he was taking drugs like marijuana and drinking alcohol. It was a lot more relaxed and he was still continuing to do this. But at home, living with Kay and Delbert, I mean, these weren't things that were really acceptable to them. And without getting him the help that he needed to overcome that and to not need drugs and alcohol, I mean, God's sake, clearly he was taking drugs and and alcohol to numb things. He clearly needed some help. And when Stephen went up into 10th grade, again, he was still struggling emotionally, and now on top of it was struggling academically because he was still being bullied. He also had these media appearances, and then he had the trials coming up as well. On top of everything, he had the trials to go through. So he was going to be missing more school. And yeah, so basically Stephen's home life was not kind of as it should have been. It should have been a happy time, and it wasn't really. I mean, no, he wasn't being abused anymore, but he also wasn't being emotionally supported. I don't know, he was safe and he was physically home, but he wasn't mentally home. Not really. Not really. And then he had 2 trials coming up. The first trial was for the kidnapping of Timmy White, and then the second trial would be for his own kidnapping. So the first trial was for Timmy White in June 1981 in Mendocino County. Sean Porman actually went to court to testify against Parnell. Now, regarding Sean, he had already been tried in juvenile court for his part in the kidnapping of Timmy. He fully cooperated, and because of that, the original charge of kidnapping was reduced to false imprisonment. And so in the end, he was given a sentence of 2 years in juvenile court. As well as Sean Porman, Timmy White also testified in court against Parnell. He identified Sean as the boy that threw him into the car, and he identified Parnell. And then also Stephen as well appeared in court. Stephen identified Timmy as the boy that Parnell had kidnapped, and he also testified against Parnell for sort of coercing him into trying to abduct other boys. When Parnell took the stand, he actually tried to blame all of Timmy's kidnapping on Sean Porman and his stepfather. Parnell actually accused the stepfather of blackmailing him, saying that he knew about Stephen's kidnapping and so was blackmailing Parnell into taking Timmy because apparently he wanted to be able to trade the child for drugs or money or whatever. And he apparently threatened Parnell's mother if Parnell didn't comply. I mean, yeah, it was absolute shite. So on June the 29th, the jury found Parnell guilty of kidnapping in the second degree. And on September the 25th, the judge sentenced Parnell to 7 years in prison. So, in preparation for Parnell's trials, the police investigated the assaults towards the other boys, not just Stephen, but the other boys as well. Now, this is a doozy. At that time, the 3-year statute of limitations in California meant that Parnell could only be charged for his assaults against Stephen or any of the other boys between 1977 and 1980. And of course, during this time, Stephen had matured. He was a teenager. And the assaults, they weren't as intense as when Stephen was a lot younger. But still, despite being the most recent 3 years, Stephen still recorded something like 87 assaults against him during that time. And this is during the period where the assaults had dramatically reduced. 87 assaults against Stephen in the last 3 years that he spent with Parnell. So whilst the police were gathering the evidence, they went to the different schools that Stephen attended, and some of his friends said that they were abused by Parnell. Now, because the abuse was outside of the Merced County district, the police had to then hand the information that they'd gathered to Mendocino County, which they did. But Mendocino County didn't follow up any of the assault charges. It didn't matter how much Merced County wanted to prosecute Parnell. The information wasn't being followed up in Mendocino County. In the end, the Merced District Attorney decided against pursuing Parnell for any of the molestation charges brought before him. They couldn't prove anything. Even the photographs that were taken, like I said, the crime scene hadn't been protected, and the journalists went in and took the pictures. There was no proof that Parnell even took the pictures. So ultimately, there wasn't enough evidence to charge Parnell for abuse. I think one of the other reasons given was that they wanted to protect Stephen. They didn't want to cause him any more embarrassment by talking about the abuse, but he ended up having to talk about it anyway in court, and I think it was a bit late to kind of save Stephen from any embarrassment. I think that ship had sailed. But yeah, that was one of the other reasons they gave for not pursuing the charges against Parnell for the sexual assault. So now, if we fast forward to December 1981, so 6 months after Timmy's trial, Parnell is having his second trial, but it's only for the kidnapping of Stephen. Nothing to do with the sexual assault. Nothing. Just the kidnapping. That's it. That's it. It's beyond disgusting. Beyond disgusting. Not a single charge was brought against Parnell for sexually assaulting Stephen. And this is me being angry. Imagine what it was like for Stephen and his family. What the hell that poor kid had been through, only to have it all thrown out of court. It didn't even go to court. Didn't even get a chance to be thrown out of court. So now Parnell is in court charged with kidnapping. But, oh yes, there's a but. Once again, the 3-year statute of limitations took effect. The kidnapping was 7 years ago, over 7 years ago, so it kind of didn't apply because it wasn't in the last 3 years. Thankfully, the DA managed to convince the court that it was an ongoing issue. So in the end, thankfully, the charges did stick. But because Parnell had made no ransom demands or anything, the charge of kidnapping kind of got reduced to second-degree kidnapping. So apparently, first-degree kidnapping requires either the death of the victim or a ransom demand, whereas second-degree kidnapping requires no ransom demand and no bodily harm. Because apparently sexual assault does not count as bodily harm. Go figure. Go figure. I can't figure. Somebody tell me, please, how that works. The other thing the courts used, this is just lovely. Stephen got into the car of his own accord. He was 7. He was 7 years old. He got into the car of his own accord. Therefore, according to Parnell's defence team, the charge of kidnapping was not correct because he wasn't kidnapped, apparently. The defence also argued that Stephen was happy to stay with Parnell because he was unhappy at home. They used sort of Delbert's kind of aggression, saying that Stephen was kind of physically abused at home because he got the occasional whooping here and there. So apparently, according to the defence, Stephen got into the car of his own free will. No force was used against him. He was happy to go along and be abused because he was unhappy at home and he wanted to be back at the Almond Ranch. Okay then. Also standing charge for kidnapping Stephen was Murphy. Even though there was more than enough evidence to prove Murphy's involvement in the kidnapping, the 3-year statute of limitations applied to him as well. So when Murphy took the stand, he recounted the events of what happened that day that they took Stephen. And so basically what he said was that on that day, he had planned to do some Christmas shopping. And he went to catch the bus, but he ended up falling asleep. And so he missed the bus in the end. And he woke up to Parnell banging on his door. offering to take him to Merced. So Murphy agreed to the lift, and after they had done the shopping, Parnell then drove them to Yosemite Parkway, and he basically told Murphy that he was studying to become a minister, and he asked Murphy to hand out these religious tracts. He also told Murphy about his plan to adopt an underprivileged child, and that's kind of why he went along with it. So in the end, Murphy stood outside the gas station where Steven was taken and handed out these religious tracts. Apparently, according to Murphy, he did try and call the police one time, but he hung up when someone answered. He lost his nerve, basically. He says that Parnell blackmailed him for money and threatened to basically blame Murphy for everything if he didn't, one, keep quiet, and two, give Parnell money. He claims not to have known anything about the abuse against Steven. It's really difficult to kind of speculate how much he knew was going on. I find it difficult to believe that he didn't know anything was going on at all, especially as he did try and call the police at one point. Why would you try and call the police if you didn't suspect something was wrong? It doesn't quite make sense to me. I don't think he had malicious intentions. It doesn't mean that what he did was right. Far from it. I don't think he had bad intentions at all, and I think he genuinely tried to help Steven. And even when he was arrested, he was relieved to find out that Steven was okay. So I don't know. Some people say that Murphy was a victim, and he kind of was. He was a victim of Parnell's manipulation. There's a scale of being a victim, isn't there? You've got Steven, who's a 10 out of 10 victim for what he went through. And then you've got Murphy kind of low down on the scale, a 1 or a 2 on the scale of being a victim. So, yeah, he kind of was a victim, just not to the same degree as Steven was. So, on January 7th, 1982, the jury found both Parnell and Murphy guilty of conspiracy to kidnap and second-degree kidnapping. On the 3rd of February, the judge carried out his sentencing. So under California law, the 2 charges, conspiracy to kidnap and second-degree kidnapping, had to be merged. And Parnell received a term of 7 years in prison, which was the maximum that he could receive at the time. However, because this was the second offence, in other words, he'd already received 7 years for kidnapping Timmy, the 2 charges overlapped, and Parnell couldn't be charged for the same crime twice. So because he had already received 7 years for Timmy, all he received was an additional 20 months for kidnapping Steven. Let me repeat that. For kidnapping Timmy for 2 weeks, Parnell received 7 years. Great. For kidnapping Steven for 7 years, Parnell received 20 months. For abusing Steven for 7 years, Parnell received nothing. So all in all, he got just over 8 years. For 2 children, Timmy and Steven, do you see why I was so angry at the beginning of this case? I think anybody who knows this story is in disbelief by the end of it. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. What I will say, though, in 1982, the Californian law was changed to allow consecutive sentences to be carried out. In other words, offenders could receive consecutive prison terms for each offence. So at least something kind of good did come out of this. As for Murphy, he received 5 years for conspiracy to kidnap, and he received another 5 years for second-degree kidnap. But once again, these had to be merged. He couldn't serve these consecutively. So all in all, he just received 5 years for kidnapping Steven. But I don't know why I said but so excitedly, because it's like a peeved off but. that 5 years that Murphy received was actually longer than the 20 months that Parnell received. So for kidnapping Stephen, Parnell got 20 months and Murphy got 5 years. This case is bonkers. So in June 1983, Murphy was released after serving 3 years of his sentence. It's funny, I'm not really angry with him only getting 3 years in the end. I don't know, I don't feel angry about Murphy. I think he got the sentence he deserved personally. I do think that he was manipulated into what he did and didn't really fully understand. Some people argue that he knew what he's doing and he's as bad as Parnell, and I get that people think that, I do. And I wouldn't argue against it because it makes sense that people think that. I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence with that one, really. What I'm not on the fence with, though, is Barbara. I am firmly in the throw away the key camp with Barbara. Because if you think Parnell was a doozy, wait till you hear this one. Barbara Mathias, you know, the woman that participated in the rape of Stephen? So Barbara fully cooperated with the police, but she claimed to have not known about the kidnapping, despite the fact that Parnell took her to try and kidnap other children. She says she knew nothing about Stephen's kidnapping. Even if we were to believe her, which, yeah, right, we don't believe her, but even if we were to believe her, she participated in the abuse. I've forgotten now, what was it? It was about 8 times, I think. 8, 9 times, something like that. Do you know what sentence she received? She wasn't arrested, charged, anything for any violation. She got away with it. So as for Kenneth Parnell, he was released on parole in 1985 after serving just 5 years. 5 years. Ultimately, Parnell received less time than Stephen. Stephen got 7 years, in a way. He was taken from his home and abused for 7 years. Parnell got 5 years. Murphy 3 years. Barbara nothing. It's a doozy. So once the trials are over, somehow, Stephen has to get on with his life. He has to try and get some kind of normalcy going. But he couldn't, because even though the media attention died down, the publicity he was receiving during the trials, in particular around the abuse, led to further bullying. So still, even knowing everything Stephen went through, he was still bullied at school. And so ultimately, Stephen finished school without graduating. So when Stephen turned 18, he had access to the reward money that he'd been given for rescuing Timmy White. And he also had another $25,000 on top of that, which he was given to make a movie of his life. Allegedly, a lot of it went on drug debts and alcohol. You know, Stephen was still in a really bad place. But he did move out of the family home. He was able to purchase a small, I guess, a trailer home for himself. But the alcohol abuse and the drug abuse was bad. He was even hospitalised at one point. You know, it wasn't great. But by 1984, around that time, he began to turn his life around. He spent his time studying for his GED, and he also participated in a programme which meant that he would go into schools and kindergartens and talk to children about the dangers of stranger danger, I guess, and try to prevent children being abducted like he was. And so despite all the crap that he was going through and the bad way that he was dealing with that crap, he was still doing something good. You know, he'd helped Timmy and he was still helping other children. Stephen did go on to meet Jodie, and in 1985 they married. She was 17, he was 20. They went on to have 2 children, Stephen Jr. and Ashley, a little boy and a little girl, although it was the other way around. The girl came first and then followed by Stephen Jr. Around this time in 1985, this is the time that Parnell was actually released on parole, and Stephen was struggling again because he didn't know where Parnell was and what Parnell was doing and whether he was abusing any more children. So Stephen found this a particularly difficult time, especially having two little ones of his own. He was ultra protective of his children, as you can imagine he would be. Now, as a parent, you're protective, but as a kidnapped parent, you can only imagine how terrifying it must have been letting his kids out of his sight for a second. Yeah, he loved his little ones to bits, and he was a brilliant father. So by 1988, Stephen was working as an advisor on the movie that was being made about his life. And there's actually a scene in the movie where Stephen plays a police officer. I don't know if you remember, but earlier on I said that Stephen had shown as a teenager some interest in joining the police, and that's when Parnell was kind of panicking about Stephen needing paperwork. Well, he was still interested in joining the police, and at this point he was actually training to become a police officer. And in the movie, the scene where the actor that plays Stephen is returning home, returning to Merced after being kidnapped, that scene, the actor who plays Stephen has two policemen by his side, and Stephen is actually one of those policemen. So yeah, he got to play a little part in the movie about his life. But ultimately, Stephen's kind of motivation for agreeing to the movie, his motivation was, he said, to spread awareness and try to stop other children being kidnapped.
It'll reach the people out there and inform them that stranger abduction, child abduction of any kind is a serious problem.
He even said, maybe some of the child that's out there might see the movie and make an attempt to go home.
Maybe some kid out there that's missing will see it and come forward and make an attempt to go home.
The movie aired in May 1989. So a couple of months later, on September the 16th, 1989, Stephen had gone to his shift at a pizza restaurant, and his shift was coming to an end. And he was driving home on his motorbike. Now, the roads were wet, it was raining. And Stephen was a very careful driver. He was very careful on the roads, and he was actually driving under the speed limit. But despite that, a car pulled out in front of him, and Stephen wasn't wearing a helmet on his motorbike, and he couldn't stop in time, and he crashed into the side of this car and flew through the air, landed on the road and hit his head. Like I say, he wasn't wearing a helmet, and he sustained serious head injuries. So serious that he died at the scene. Other motorists did stop to help him, but he was drifting in and out of consciousness. Yeah, he was pronounced dead by the time he got to the hospital. He was 24 years old. He'd been through hell and back. He was just beginning to turn his life around, and his life came to an end just like that. It's such a tragic ending. So the driver, Antonio Loera, he actually fled to Mexico. They did find him, and he was charged with hit and run and manslaughter. But the manslaughter part was dropped because an investigation revealed the car had, mechanical faults, a defective carburetor and a loose throttle. So yeah, the manslaughter part was dropped. So in the end, he got 3 months in prison, 12 months probation, and a $100 fine. I mean, it wasn't his fault if the car was faulty, but why did he flee the scene? I guess he was just scared, but Stephen didn't get the justice he deserved. The day after Stephen died, The movie, I Know My First Name is Steven, actually went on to win 4 Emmys. It got 4 awards. Steven didn't see them. He didn't know. So Steven's funeral was held on September the 20th, 1989 at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Around about 450 people attended his funeral. Timmy White, who was about 14 at this point, he was actually a pallbearer. So the two kind of reunited again. Stephen was laid to rest at Merced County Cemetery, and the inscription on Stephen's casket said, "Going home." It still makes me sad. I know this story inside out, and I know the ending. I think it's the inscription that gets to me, to say "going home," because it's just... He did get to go home. He did. But equally, he didn't really, because his life was just beginning. He was just having his family. And I think that stage of his life was where he was truly going home. And that was just taken away from him. And, oh, it just makes me sad. So that was the story of Steven Stayner, the boy that became a hero and had massive injustice against him. I mean, that sentence that Parnell received, it was taking the piss, really. And then, of course, his life was tragically struck down before he even got an opportunity to begin his life, really. It's really sad. Really sad. Now, you may have noticed I have so far provided very little detail about Parnell, about his life, where he came from, and kind of what led up to the point of him kidnapping Stephen. And I've done that for a reason, because I wanted this case to be about Stephen. So now that we've come to the end of the case, I feel like I can talk about Parnell, because really, he's an irrelevant piece of crap that doesn't deserve speaking about. But it's interesting. The whole point of true crime is to kind of try and understand the motivations, I guess. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Kenneth Parnell now. So Kenneth Eugene Parnell was born on the 26th of September 1931 in Amarillo, Texas. His parents, Cecil and Mary, divorced in 1937. And then Mary moved with Parnell and 3 of her other children from a previous marriage to Bakersfield in California. Now, Mary was an extremely religious woman. She required her children to accompany her to the Assembly of God Church 3 times a week. And she would teach her children the Bible and make them pray daily. And this kind of explains a little bit the link to Parnell pretending to train for the ministry. So Parnell had a troubled life, and it started around about the age of 5, around the time that his parents divorced. Parnell was so upset by his parents' separation that he began to self-harm. Shortly after his parents separated, he actually pulled out 4 of his teeth with a pair of pliers. Oh. When Parnell was 8, he shone a torch in his eye for such a long time that he actually needed corrective surgery to, well, correct his eye. By the time he was 9, he punctured the soles of his feet by jumping off a shed roof onto wooden boards that had nails sticking up. He's 9 years old, and by this age, he's punctured his feet, he's pulled out his teeth, he's damaged his eyes, and then in another incident, he pointed a .22 caliber gun, pistol, at his abdomen and threatened to commit suicide. So Parnell is pretty screwed up, and this just came from the parents' divorce. So I don't know. Personally, I think something else was going on there, because I'm not sure divorce alone would make you self-harm to this extent, not when you're so young. On the one hand, I feel absolutely terrible for Parnell, because he obviously had a psychiatric issue that he needed help with. On the other hand, I know damn well what he grew up to be and what he did to Stephen and other children. So I'm not sympathetic at all. So in 1944, his mother Mary purchased or invested in a boarding house. And when Parnell was 13 years old, one of his mother's boarders befriended Parnell and basically persuaded Parnell to engage in fellatio with him. After this incident with the boarder, Parnell set fire to a pasture, a field. Basically, he was sent to Bakersfield Juvenile Detention Hall facility, I don't know, some kind of juvenile facility. And this was the recommendation of a psychiatrist who thought locking him up would cure his perversion. So basically, the boarder persuaded Parnell to perform fellatio, and Parnell was the one who had the perversion. So I think we need to make a distinction. The adult Parnell, I do not feel sorry for. The child Parnell, I do. These are all things that obviously lead him to become the way he did as an adult. And in 1945, sodomy was actually illegal, hence why it was treated as a crime and that he was sent to the juvenile hall. And it also explains a little bit why he told Stephen that this was kind of a normal father-son relationship, because he was a teenager when this happened. And I don't know, I can't help but think that maybe if he hadn't been locked up and it was treated like a crime, or at least like he had committed a crime as opposed to the other dude that was the one that actually committed the crime, then things may have turned out differently for Parnell. Because I guess if Parnell did have homosexual tendencies growing up, and then being made to feel that it was wrong would force him in later life to kind of hide the way that he was and just add to the way that he became. So after a few months at the juvenile hall, he was released. And when he turned 14, he stole a car. He was once again arrested and sent to a juvenile facility once again, a facility for male offenders, and he remained incarcerated until February 1947. Whilst he was there, he engaged in homosexual behaviour. In December 1947, Parnell is now 16 years old, and he's arrested again for committing public sex acts with men. So back then, clearly, homosexuality was a crime, and he was basically forced to keep his homosexuality hidden. You can't help but wonder if he wasn't kind of forced into squashing the way he felt, that maybe he would have gone to develop normal relationship with men, perhaps, possibly. I mean, I don't know about the second part of the statement I just said, but it was definitely wrong being made to feel like a criminal for having these feelings towards men, and we're talking men of the same age as yourself, not little children, obviously. So a couple of months later, he steals another car, and once again he ends up incarcerated in California's Lancaster facility. Now, he actually escaped the facility and returned to Bakersfield. And while he was there, he became infatuated with a young boy. But he was rearrested and sent to Kern County Jail in Bakersfield. And while there, he tried to take his life by drinking disinfectant. When he recovered, he spent 90 days in a psychiatric facility. It was a state mental hospital in Napa. But the young boy that he had become infatuated with, he was desperate to return to this young lad and once again escape, returning to Bakersfield in a stolen car. He was rearrested, sent back to Lancaster, and then he was released in May 1949, and he moved back with his mother. Later that year, he met and married a 15-year-old girl called Patsy Dorton. So it's a bit confusing why he met and married this girl all of a sudden. I'm inclined to think it was a way for him to keep up appearances. He was being rearrested and rearrested and rearrested, and I guess this was a way for him to kind of, somehow make it look like he was following the rules, and perhaps as well for his mother, because his mother's, a very religious woman. Maybe he felt he needed to for her sake. I don't know. It's a bit kind of weird and out the blue, that one. But yep, that's what he did. So in 1951, when Parnell was 19, he purchased a fake deputy sheriff badge, and he used it to impersonate a police officer, and he used it on a 9-year-old boy. Basically, this 9-year-old, Bobby Green, was playing with his friends, and Parnell went up to them and he told Bobby that he matched the description of somebody that the police were out looking for, and that he needed Bobby to accompany him to the station. Obviously, Bobby did what he was told. He believed Parnell was a police officer, and so he got in the car, and Parnell then drove the terrified child to a remote area in Kern River Canyon, and there proceeded to molest Bobby. Parnell was actually arrested 6 days later because after the assault, he drove Bobby back to the area that he'd been playing in. And so Bobby was obviously able to go home and tell his parents what had happened. And so Parnell was arrested 6 days later, and he confessed to making Bobby perform fellatio. He also confessed to thinking about murdering Bobby. He thought about strangling him so that he couldn't tell on Parnell. But thankfully, he drove Bobby back safely, thank God. So Parnell was held at Kern County Jail until April the 20th, when he appeared before a judge and he pled guilty to the charge of lewd and lascivious contact on and with the body, members and private parts of a male child under the age of 14. The judge ordered Parnell to be held at Kern County Jail for 3 separate psychiatric evaluations. Don't know why he needed 3 of them, but he did. And on May the 11th, the judge heard the findings of these evaluations. And these findings basically concluded that Parnell was a sexual psychopath, and recommended treatment in a state mental hospital. The judge ordered Parnell to be sent to Norwalk State Hospital for an official evaluation, and there he was diagnosed as a sexual psychopath, but without psychosis, so they considered him legally sane. So after the diagnosis, another hearing was held, and the judge ordered that he be committed to Norwalk State Hospital for an indeterminate amount of time. Throughout this period of the hearings and the incarcerations, his wife, don't forget he was married, he obviously did what he did to Bobby, but he was still married. Now, she gave birth. So at this point, Parnell had a baby. He had a child. Yeah, Parnell had a daughter, but he was incarcerated, so he didn't see her. Now, allegedly, whilst he was incarcerated, one of the psychiatric findings, reports, said that Parnell seemed excited about having a daughter and couldn't wait to see her, and he wanted to explore the various medical treatments available to him to get better. And in June, Parnell actually wrote to the judge, asking the judge to reconsider releasing him back to Bakersfield. I don't know what to make of this. Was this Parnell genuinely wanting to get better, genuinely wanting to return to his wife and daughter? Or was this Parnell manipulating the judge, manipulating people into feeling sorry for him and letting him go? Knowing Parnell's history and knowing how darn good he was at manipulating people, I suspect this was part of his manipulation. However, Parnell kind of took matters into his own hands, and he actually sawed one of the locks from a window and escaped. He was captured a couple of weeks later and placed in a maximum security ward. But on October the 14th, he escaped again. Again. He's quite an escape artist. He actually managed to escape for 4 months this time, and he was later found in New Mexico. And then he ended up being sent to San Quentin Maximum Security Prison in California, and he served just over 3 years. It might be worth mentioning that Parnell had escaped twice at this point, and during neither of these escapes did he go and visit his daughter. So him writing to the judge and asking for the judge to reconsider his sentence, again, I think that adds to Parnell being a manipulator. If he wanted to see his daughter that badly, then why didn't he during his escape attempts? During a later interview that Parnell gave to a journalist at the East Bay Express, he actually told this journalist that one of the reasons he molested Bobby Green was because his wife was pregnant and she couldn't satisfy him, and so he needed another outlet. There you go. In April 1955, Parnell was paroled, and the condition of his parole was that he receive ongoing psychiatric treatment. This was a condition he didn't meet. I don't know why they didn't reinforce it. I don't know, 1955, I guess admin, paperwork, all that stuff would have been different, but he didn't carry on getting the psychiatric treatment that he needed. So he went and visited his mother in Bakersfield, and whilst he was there, he got a job, and this actually also violated his parole conditions. And in September, he had a parole hearing, or a parole violation hearing, and then he was sentenced to going back to prison. So he went to Folsom State Prison for 3 months until December the 17th, and then he was paroled back to Bakersfield. So Parnell and Patsy divorced in 1957, and in that same year, Parnell went on to marry a woman who was 10 years his senior. She was called Emma, and she gave birth to his second daughter, although they actually went on to divorce again 3 years later in 1961. But again, why he's marrying these women, I have no idea. And in actual fact, Parnell claimed to have married a third woman, although there's no evidence of this. Nobody can kind of find any documentation, so we have no idea if he's telling the truth or not. I'm not quite sure why he would lie about it, but there's no records of a marriage or a divorce, so who knows. But he definitely married 2 women and had 2 children. Oh, God. Why they even married him, I don't know. I mean, maybe they didn't know his history. I have no idea. But, oh, can you even imagine being married to that man? It's vile. It's vile. Ugh. So Parnell ended up moving to Utah, and he was absolutely desperate for money by this point. And he basically used a revolver to hold up a service station in Salt Lake City. And he was caught, and in 1961 he was convicted of robbery and grand larceny. Basically, for the next few years, Parnell kind of drifted around from job to job, doing a bit of this and a bit of that, and, just doing whatever. And then eventually in 1972, the Curry Company, they were the company that was in charge of the hiring at Yosemite. They hired him as a night auditor at the Yosemite Lodge. When Parnell applied for the job with the Curry Company, he actually lied on his application form. He lied about his criminal past and his mental health history. And like a lot of the people that worked there, he saw Yosemite, that area, as a good place to lie low. And that's when he met Murphy, and bada boom. That's kind of what took Parnell to Yosemite. The next few years, we obviously know what happened. You know, Stephen was abducted, and then we had the trials and whatnot. In 1985, Parnell was released after 5 years. He was paroled for good behaviour. Yeah, so he was released on parole, and his parole conditions stipulated that he wasn't allowed to leave Alameda County, and he wasn't allowed in the company of children. Duh. Yeah. He also had to attend regular counselling sessions. So his parole officers did check up on Parnell 6 times per week at the boarding house that he was staying at in Berkeley City. In 1987, he got a job at a boys' boarding house in California. So basically, his criminal history went completely unchecked. I want to say God knows what he did there, but I think we all know what he probably did there. But, you know, there's nothing written down to say what he did, if he did anything, if he did get away with anything. Let's hope to God he didn't. But, yeah. So in 1989, when the movie I Know My First Name is Stephen was aired, that's when he was actually found out and removed from the job, thank God, because he was recognised. Just when you think Parnell couldn't do anything else, he basically kind of, after the movie and after he was fired, he kind of disappeared for 10 or so years, and nobody really knows what he was doing during that time. But a reporter actually managed to track him down, and when the reporter went to his house, according to this reporter, there were children's toys and bikes at Parnell's home. Why would this man, who I'm not sure how old he is at this point, he must be in his sort of 60s possibly, somewhere around there. Why would he have children's toys and clothes and a bike if he wasn't either doing something or planning to do something? He told the reporter the reason for having these things is that he wanted to keep up with the younger generation. Okay. So in 2002, oh, you're not going to believe this, but in 2002, the police receive a tip-off that Parnell was attempting to abduct a young boy. So he was 71 by this point, and he was in really, really poor health. He had numerous illnesses. He had suffered a stroke, emphysema, diabetes, and basically he had 24-hour nursing care at his Berkeley home. He wasn't very well at all. So basically, during this time, he offered the caregiver's sister $500 to procure a child for him. What he requested was an English-speaking black boy between 4 and 6 years old. And he also wanted the birth certificate. Now, it's pretty obvious that the reason he's asking for the birth certificate is because of his experience with Stephen and not having the correct paperwork with him. He obviously learned from that past mistake of not having the correct paperwork. So the caregiver's sister was called Diane Stevens, and she was actually aware of Parnell's criminal past. And she agreed to go along with it because she feared that Parnell would just ask somebody else if she declined. Now, she had no intention, just to make this clear, she had no intention of going along with it. So she was pretending the whole time. But she was doing this, like I say, to make sure that he didn't go somewhere else and go to somebody that would actually go through with this. So she accepted the offer, but she actually informed the police, and they arranged like a sting operation. So on January the 3rd, 2003, Diane told Parnell that she had found him a boy, and she arranged to first drop off the birth certificate at his apartment, and that would be in exchange for $100. And then she would go and get the boy from the car and return with the boy, and then exchange the further $400. Now, during the first phase, the dropping off the birth certificate, Diane wore a wire, and so she entered Parnell's apartment to deliver this birth certificate, and the police then obviously charged in, and they found all the evidence they needed. They found the $400 in his pocket, which, was going to be the second part of the transaction. And they found children's toys and clothes and sexual paraphernalia. Now, later on, during a jailhouse interview, Parnell actually claimed that his intention for getting the child was innocent. He just wanted a family. He just wanted a son of his own. He wanted to raise the boy like any other child. He claimed that he wanted to be loved. Poor Parnell, he wanted to be loved. Now, we know this is absolute crap. But I'll tell you something that he said when he was stipulating what child he wanted, something that he told Diane, and this is something that came up in court. He actually said, "Don't bring me any dirty arse brats, and make sure his arsehole is clean." Well, if he's asking for clean arses, then I wonder why. Diane testified in court that, he'd said that this child had to have a clean rectum. Clearly, sexual intent was there. So the man is just vile, just absolute vile. So obviously we've guessed that he did go to trial. And actually, Sean Pullman and Timmy White were both at this trial, and Timmy testified about obviously Parnell kidnapping him, and Sean testified about the manipulation and Parnell, how he got him to help kidnap Timmy. And actually Timmy and Sean kind of made up, and Timmy forgave Sean, which was quite sweet, I think. Obviously, Stephen couldn't be there, but a transcript from his original trial was actually read in court as well, and it was all evidence that helped to send Parnell down again. So on February the 9th, 2004, he was sentenced to 25 years. 25 years. And he didn't actually get a child this time. Thank God he didn't get a child this time. But he got 25 years just for trying to get a child, whereas he got pretty much nothing for actually getting Stephen. And just trying to put the two things into perspective, I mean, obviously it's great that he got 25 years, but just when you put it side by side with the way that Stephen was treated, it's very different. But so this time it came under the 3 strikes rule. I'm not quite sure why Bobby Green didn't come under the 3 strikes rule. Either way, he shouldn't have really had an opportunity to even attempt to abduct this third child. And I mean, don't forget, he'd kind of gone off the radar before this, and I'm pretty sure he would have been up to no good during this time. I don't personally think that nothing had happened in between Stephen, Timmy, and then this third abduction attempt. But that's just me speculating. There is absolutely zero evidence for that, and that's just what I think, because knowing his history, it seems unbelievable that he wouldn't have at least tried. Even if he wasn't successful, he probably terrified the hell out of some other kids, even just trying. So, on January the 21st, 2008, Parnell died. He was 76 years old, and he died of natural causes. He was actually incarcerated at the time. He was in the medical facility at Vacaville, California. But because he died, he ended up serving basically less than 4 years of that sentence that he was given. So somehow, only serving 4 years of that 25-year sentence, somehow he kind of escaped justice again. He always seems to manage to escape kind of justice. So that was the story of Steven Stayner, the harrowing story of Steven Stayner, and how this kid went through absolute crap and justice wasn't served. But we've got to remember all the good that Steven did and the hero that he was. So after Steven's death, the Stayners actually sold their house in Betty Street, and Delbert actually died at the age of 79. This was in 2013. Now, Carrie Stayner, I'm not going to go into Carrie Stayner. I'm going to do another video about Carrie Stayner. Good things did not come from Carrie Stayner. He actually murdered 4 women. He was the complete opposite to his brother. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say about Carrie. So Timmy White, he went on to become a deputy at the LA County Sheriff's Department. And so he actually married and had 2 children. And bless him, he actually kind of followed in Stephen's footsteps and went around to different schools giving talks on stranger danger. And on April the 1st, 2010, tragically, he suffered a pulmonary embolism and he died. He was just 35 years old. He still had a lot of life to live and a lot of good to do. So he came to a really sad end as well. So, like I've said a few times, I think the key thing from this case is to remember the good that Steven did. And back in 2010, the year that Timmy died, a monument was erected in Merced's Applegate Park. And this monument is of Steven holding Timmy's hand and leading him to safety. And it's a monument to Steven's bravery and a message of hope to other children that might be lost and looking for their way home. That's what Steven wanted when he died. That's what Timmy wanted when he died. He continued Steven's work. And that's the message in this monument for all the children out there that are lost to find their way home. You look after yourselves, be kind, and do good in the world.